Survival is about making tough choices. Sometimes it's about finding water in a desert or building a shelter in a storm. But the story of Sawney Bean is a twisted, horrifying lesson in survival gone monstrously wrong. He wasn't born a monster, or so the legends say. He was born Alexander Bean in the 15th century, a simple man, a tanner or a hedger by trade. He had a choice: live a life of honest, grueling work, or take a different path. He chose the latter. He found a woman, Black Agnes Douglas, who was as feral and unwilling to bow to society as he was. They say she was accused of witchcraft, an outcast just like him. Together they turned their backs on civilization, on towns, on everything. They disappeared into the wild, seeking a place where they could live by their own brutal rules, a place far from the prying eyes of the world. Their decision was a radical one. It wasn't just about escaping taxes or the local laird. It was a complete rejection of humanity itself. They didn't want to build a new life, they wanted to dismantle the very idea of one. They made their way to the coast of Galloway, a rugged, unforgiving landscape of cliffs and churning seas. This wasn't a place for the faint of heart. The winds howl, the waves crash, and the terrain is treacherous. For Sawney and his wife, this was paradise. It was a fortress, a natural barrier that would keep the world out and their dark secrets in. They weren't just a couple anymore. They were the alpha pair of a new, terrifying pack. They would go on to have children, and those children would have children, all born into a world of darkness and isolation, knowing nothing but the cave and the hunt. This family grew in the most unnatural way imaginable. Cut off from all human contact, their world was the cave, the sea, and each other. The legends say they had 8 sons and 6 daughters. As these children grew, they knew no other life, no other morality. The normal bonds of family were twisted into something grotesque. Brothers and sisters interbred, producing a new generation of grandchildren. The clan swelled in numbers, becoming a feral tribe of nearly 50 souls, all sharing the same blood and the same horrifying secrets. They were a self-sustaining unit, a closed ecosystem of predators, with their own language of grunts and a complete lack of what we would call a soul. Their survival depended on a singular, monstrous principle. The outside world was not for joining, but for harvesting. Their isolation was absolute, a key to their long reign of terror. For over 2 decades, they existed as a ghost story, a whispered fear. People went missing, yes. Travelers vanished on the lonely coastal roads, but no one could piece it together. Who could imagine a clan of savages living in a cave, breeding in the dark, and preying on anyone who dared to pass by? The very idea was unthinkable, a tale too dark for even the most superstitious minds of the time. This wasn't a single killer or a small band of robbers. This was a dynasty of predators, an entire family unit whose sole purpose was to hunt, kill, and consume. Their success was built on their secrecy and the sheer audacity of their existence, hidden in plain sight along a well-traveled coast. Every survivor knows the importance of a good shelter. It protects you from the elements, from predators. For the Bean clan, their shelter was a masterstroke of natural concealment. They found a sea cave near Benane Head, a place that was perfectly designed for their monstrous existence. The entrance was small, almost unnoticeable among the jumble of rocks and cliffs. But the real genius of its location was the tide. Twice a day, the powerful Scottish tide would surge in, completely flooding the entrance and washing away any evidence of their presence. The water would rise and cover the cave mouth, hiding it from ships at sea and from anyone walking the shoreline. It was a natural curtain, a liquid gate that sealed them in and locked the world out for hours at a time. Inside this hidden entrance, the cave was not a simple hole in the rock. It was a labyrinth. The legends describe it as a sprawling network of tunnels and chambers that stretched nearly a mile deep into the cliffside. This wasn't just a place to sleep. It was their entire world. They had different chambers for different purposes, a grotesque parody of a normal home. There was a main living area, a place for the children, and most chillingly, a larder. This was where they stored the grim rewards of their hunts. The cave would have been a place of unimaginable horror, damp, dark, and filled with the stench of death and decay. The constant sound would have been the dripping of water from the ceiling and the distant thunderous roar of the sea, a constant reminder of their isolation and the power of the nature they had embraced. Living in such an environment requires extreme adaptation. The Bean clan became creatures of the dark. Their eyes would have adjusted to the near-constant gloom, their senses sharpened to navigate the winding passages. They learned the rhythms of the tide as if it were their own heartbeat. It dictated their entire schedule, when they could leave to hunt, when they had to be back inside, and when they were safe from discovery. The cave was their fortress, their nursery, and their tomb all in one. It provided fresh water from seeping springs deep within the rock, and a constant cool temperature perfect for preserving their gruesome food source. For over 25 years, this horrifying den remained their secret stronghold, a place no one in the outside world even knew existed. The psychological impact of living in such a place is hard to fathom. Imagine children born into that darkness, never seeing the full light of day, never knowing the warmth of a proper home. Their playground was a network of cold, wet tunnels. Their lullabies were the cries of seabirds and the crash of waves. This environment shaped them, molding them into the perfect predators for their chosen lifestyle. They were as much a part of the wild landscape as the rocks and the sea. They were no longer human in the way we understand it. They were a unique, terrifying species that had carved out a niche for itself, thriving on secrecy, darkness, and the flesh of their own kind. The cave wasn't just their home, it was the womb from which this nightmare was born and nurtured. The clan's method of survival was brutally simple ambush. They were masters of their territory, the lonely roads and paths that snaked along the Galloway coast. Under the cover of twilight or the pre-dawn mist, they would lie in wait. They worked as a pack, a coordinated unit of hunters. A lone traveler or a small group stood no chance. They would burst from the gorse and shadows, a terrifying wave of feral humans. They were fast, silent, and utterly without mercy. Their attacks were not just robberies, they were harvests. The goal was not just to take valuables, but to take the people themselves. They would overwhelm their victims with sheer numbers and brute force, dragging them off the path and back towards the dark maw of their cave. Once a victim was taken, the true horror began. This is what separated the Bean clan from common bandits and made them the stuff of nightmares. They were cannibals. Back in the deep, dark chambers of their cave, the bodies were butchered like livestock. The flesh was their primary source of food. They would dismember the corpses, and parts were eaten immediately. What they couldn't consume right away was preserved for later. The legends are grimly specific, describing how body parts were pickled in brine and limbs were hung from the cave walls like cured hams. This grotesque larder ensured the clan's survival through lean times and harsh winters. It was a production line of death, a system perfected over 2.5 decades of relentless slaughter. This practice of cannibalism was the ultimate act of their rejection of society. To eat another human is the greatest taboo, but for the Bean clan, it was simply practical. It was their way of life. They left no witnesses, and they made use of every part of their kill. The bones and other remains were often tossed into the sea, carried away by the powerful currents, or hidden in the deepest recesses of their cave system. This explains why, for so long, the disappearances were just a mystery. There were no bodies, no clues, just people who had vanished into thin air. The local communities were terrified, but they were looking for murderers or kidnappers, not a self-sufficient tribe of man-eaters living just off the coast. The fear they created was immense. The coastal road became known as a place of death. People spoke in hushed tones of demons or evil spirits that haunted the area. Innkeepers were wrongly accused and sometimes executed for the disappearances of their guests. The region lived under a cloud of paranoia and terror. No one felt safe. The authorities were baffled, launching investigations that went nowhere. How could they possibly find a foe that seemed to be supernatural? The Bean clan's greatest weapon was the sheer unbelievability of their existence. They were a horror beyond the comprehension of the 15th century mind, and this allowed them to hunt and thrive for a generation, their legend growing with every person who vanished without a trace. Every predator, no matter how clever, eventually makes a mistake. The end for the Sawney Bean clan came not from a planned investigation, but from a failed hunt. One evening, the clan ambushed a husband and wife returning from a local fair. They were on horseback, and the man was a skilled fighter, armed with a sword and pistol. He was not going down without a fight. As the feral pack swarmed them, they managed to pull his wife from her horse, and she was killed and dismembered before his eyes. But the husband fought back with the ferocity of a cornered animal. He used his horse to trample some of his attackers and his sword to cut down others. His desperate struggle bought him precious time. As fate would have it, a large group of other fairgoers appeared on the road, and the clan, unused to such resistance and the risk of being outnumbered, retreated into the shadows. This was the break the authorities needed. For the first time, there was a survivor. There was an eyewitness who could describe the unthinkable, not ghosts or demons, but a pack of wild, savage people. He told his horrifying story to the magistrates in Glasgow, and the news quickly reached King James VI of Scotland himself. The king, intrigued and horrified, decided to lead the hunt personally. He assembled a force of 400 armed men and a pack of bloodhounds. This was no longer a local matter. It was a full-scale military operation. They descended on the Galloway coast, determined to scour every inch of the rugged terrain and put an end to the terror that had plagued the region for a quarter of a century. The search was difficult, but the bloodhounds were the key. The dogs, with their keen sense of smell, were not fooled by the landscape. They picked up the scent of death and decay that clung to the area around the cave, a scent that human noses had missed. They led the king's men to the inconspicuous waterlogged entrance. At low tide, the soldiers entered, torches held high, and what they found was a scene from hell itself. The tunnels were littered with the bones of countless victims. Valuables from decades of robberies lay in piles, and in the deepest chamber, they found the clan's larder human limbs hanging from the walls, barrels filled with pickled remains. The full, horrifying truth was finally exposed to the light. The clan was captured without much of a fight. Dragged from their dark world into the light of day, they were a pathetic and horrifying sight. They were taken to Edinburgh in chains, their fate already sealed. There was no trial. Their crimes were considered so heinous, so far beyond the pale of human law, that they were condemned to immediate and brutal execution. The men were dismembered, suffering the same fate they had inflicted on so many others. The women and children were forced to watch before being burned alive at the stake. It was a grim, brutal end to a grim, brutal story. Justice in the 15th century was as unforgiving as the wilderness that had spawned the Sawney Bean clan. Their legend, however, would survive. A chilling lesson in survival and the darkness that can lurk just beyond the edge of our world.